Not everything that breaks in life is a sign of failure. There are moments when what seems like disorder is actually adjustment. You went through a sequence of changes that you did not ask for, did not plan, and could not avoid. Things fell out of place. People distanced themselves. Certainties ceased to exist. And even so, you kept going. Not with enthusiasm, but with awareness. For a long time, you had to learn to deal with instability. You learned to adapt, to observe more than react, to choose carefully where you placed your energy. This did not happen because you wanted to grow spiritually or evolve. It happened because there was no other option but to mature. Life demanded that of you. In the midst of these processes, something important was being built. Discernment. You began to recognize what drains, what strengthens, what is noise, and what is essential. Situations that once provoked despair now provoke analysis. Relationships that once seemed indispensable are now seen with more lucidity. This change did not come from books or speeches. It came from direct experience. What many would call a difficult phase was, in practice, a period of internal reorganizing. Old ways of thinking lost their meaning. Old expectations fell. And without realizing it, you began to operate from a more conscious place, less impulsive and more aligned with who you really are. This kind of transition does not happen with everyone. It arises when someone needs to leave a level of survival for a level of direction. It is not a promise of ease, but of clarity. And it is exactly at this point that you find yourself now, no longer just trying to endure, but beginning to understand where you are being led. Chosen one, at some point along the way, life stopped working as before. It was not a sudden collapse, but a continuous wearing down. Things that seemed solid began to lose support. People changed, contexts unraveled, plans that once seemed certain stopped making sense. None of this happened all at once, but the accumulation was impossible to ignore. This period did not bring immediate answers. It brought questions, uncomfortable questions that forced you to review choices, priorities, and even the way you saw yourself. What was once tolerable began to bother you. What once seemed sufficient started to feel shallow. Not because the world changed, but because you changed internally. There were moments when everything seemed out of control. You tried to maintain structures that were already fragile, insisted on paths that no longer responded, and held on to bonds that no longer had the same foundation. This generated exhaustion. An exhaustion that did not come only from an excess of tasks, but from an excess of adaptation. This was the beginning of the dismantling. Not as punishment, but as a natural consequence of an inner growth that no longer fit into the same molds. Life began to remove what did not keep up with your maturity, not with delicacy, but with precision. And each thing that fell left an uncomfortable yet necessary space. You had to learn to live without ready-made answers. You had to deal with the feeling of being between phases, without the comfort of the old, and without the clarity of the new. This intermediate space is usually the hardest, because it offers neither security nor clear direction. Even so, it is there that the reorganization happens. During this period, you are forced to develop something essential: inner autonomy. It was no longer possible to depend on constant validation, external promises, or others' expectations. Decisions became more solitary, choices more conscious. And even when you doubted, you moved forward with more discernment than before. The dismantling did not take only external things. It took old versions of you, ways of reacting, of justifying yourself, of accepting less than you deserved. Little by little, you realized that you could no longer act as before, even if you tried. Something inside prevented a return to the old pattern. This process was silent and little recognized. There were no applause. There was inner resistance, nights of reflection, painful adjustments. But it was there that the foundation for what would come next was built. Before any real elevation, the old structure needs to be dismantled. And that is exactly what happened. While everything seemed unstable on the outside, something was being strengthened on the inside. This period required you to develop discernment. Not the kind that comes from theories or advice, but the kind that is born from direct experience. You learned to recognize signs before they became problems. You learned to perceive when to persist and when to retreat. Living with uncertainty made you more attentive. You began to observe more, speak less, and choose more carefully. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. Situations that once would have led you to impulse now go through analysis. Emotions still exist, but they no longer govern every decision. This process also strengthened your relationship with yourself. You were forced to deal with silence, with your own company, and with thoughts that were previously muffled by routine. This brought discomfort, but also understanding. You began to know yourself in deeper layers, understanding limits, needs, and real values. Another clear change was the way you deal with losses. Before, each rupture seemed like an absolute end. Now, even when it hurts, you can perceive that not every loss is a setback. Some are course corrections. This change in perspective does not eliminate the pain, but prevents it from paralyzing you. You also began to realize that not every fight needs to be fought. Some battles are resolved with distance, silence, and repositioning. This maturity does not come from weakness, but from understanding. You learned that preserving energy is just as important as acting. The process taught you to respect time, not the time imposed by others, but your own. You stopped comparing yourself so much, chasing external milestones, and measuring your worth by criteria that no longer make sense. This does not mean an absence of ambition, but a change in direction. Internally, something stabilized. Even without external guarantees, you began to feel a firmer foundation, a silent confidence that does not depend on immediate results. This foundation is what allows you to sustain bigger changes without losing yourself. What was developed in you during this period is not visible at first glance, but it is solid. Clarity, discernment, self-control, and emotional maturity. These qualities do not arise in easy phases. They are born exactly in periods like this, where everything seems unstable, but is actually being reorganized. This was not a wasted time. It was a formative time, and everything that was developed here is what allows you to move forward without collapsing when new opportunities arise. At a certain moment, you realize that many of the expectations you sustained no longer held. Expectations about people, about paths, about how life should happen. None of this fell all at once. It was being corroded little by little, until it became clear that insisting on them cost more than letting them go. This breaking was a silent divider. There was no big event that marked the end, but there was a clear inner change. You stopped romanticizing situations that did not deliver what they promised. You began to see more objectively what worked and what merely occupied space. This kind of lucidity does not arise without emotional wear. You also began to realize that many frustrations came from trying to control the pace of things. There was a hurry to arrive, to resolve, to stabilize. When that did not happen, there came a feeling of delay or failure. Over time, that logic began to dissolve. You understood that not everything responds to force, and that insisting outside the right time generates more rupture than progress. The illusions did not fall only about the external world. They also fell about you. Old ideas about who you needed to be, what you needed to prove, And even the kind of recognition you sought lost strength. Not because you gave up, but because you matured. Certain ambitions were reviewed, not abandoned, but repositioned. This process was uncomfortable because it required accepting truths that were not pleasant. Truths such as, not every effort will be rewarded immediately. Not every good intention will be recognized. Not every bond deserves continuity. Accepting this did not make you harder. It made you more realistic. With this breaking of expectations, an unexpected relief also came. You stopped carrying weights that were not yours. You stopped trying to maintain structures that only stood because of your insistence. This opened internal space, a space that at first seemed empty, but soon proved necessary. You began to act with more discernment, to choose where to invest time, energy, and attention. This selection did not come from ego, but from the exhaustion of wasting inner resources. You understood that not everything deserves a response, reaction, or explanation. This was the moment when life stopped being a sequence of frustrated attempts at control and became a process of reading the signs more attentively. You still did not have all the answers, but you already knew better which questions were worth it. The breaking of illusions did not leave you lost. It left you more lucid. And this lucidity is fundamental for any phase of real growth. Without it, any elevation turns into instability. With it, the next step begins to be taken with more awareness and less wear. After the illusions fall and expectations adjust, something begins to change in the way you position yourself internally. It is not a visible change to others, but it is deeply noticeable to you. The need to prove yourself decreases. The anxiety for validation weakens, and haste gives way to more strategic observation. This repositioning does not happen by immediate conscious decision. It arises as a natural result of what you have lived. After so many attempts, falls, and reevaluations, you begin to move with more caution and less impulsiveness. Not out of fear, but out of understanding. You begin to realize that many answers do not come when they are demanded, but when the inner scenario is ready to receive them. This completely changes the relationship with time. Delay stops being seen only as an obstacle and begins to be understood as adjustment. At this point, life begins to test something different. No longer your resistance, but your coherence. Situations arise to check whether you have really learned to respect limits, to listen to your own intuition, and not to repeat old patterns. The test is no longer external, it is internal. You realize that you can no longer deceive yourself easily. Misaligned decisions generate immediate discomfort. Environments that do not match who you have become quickly drain you. People who demand old versions of you begin to cause discomfort. This is a clear sign of repositioning. Ascension does not begin with external achievements. It begins when you stop accepting less than what you know no longer works. When you choose quality instead of quantity. When you prefer coherence over approval. This kind of change does not create noise, but it creates stability. You also begin to deal better with silence. It is no longer seen only as absence, but as a space for adjustment. In this silence, you notice ideas organizing themselves, priorities becoming clearer, and decisions maturing without haste. The internal repositioning prepares you to sustain bigger changes. Without it, any progress becomes overload. With it, growth becomes gradual and sustainable. You do not rise to impress, you rise to align. This phase is less about doing and more about being. Less about seeking and more about allowing. Not in the sense of passivity, but of trust in your own process. You begin to understand that life responds better when you are whole, not when you are forcing. This repositioning is not the end of the road, but it is the point at which everything begins to make more sense. It is the silent foundation on which any real ascension is built. After everything that has been dismantled and reorganized internally, life changes the way it acts with you. Before, it seemed that everything was a test. Situations arose only to measure your resistance, your patience, and your ability to endure. Now the movement is different. There is no longer so much external pressure, but there is observation. You begin to realize that the challenges no longer come to break you, but to check whether you maintain what you have learned. Small choices start to carry more weight. Not because the risk has increased, but because awareness has increased. Life no longer demands brute strength, it demands coherence. At this stage, repeating old patterns becomes uncomfortable, almost immediately. Not because someone punishes you, but because you yourself feel when something is not aligned. Intuition becomes more sensitive. Tolerance for what drains energy decreases. This is not arrogance, it is maturity. You also realize that you no longer need to prove anything to anyone. The impulse to justify yourself, to over-explain, or to convince others loses strength. Not because you have become indifferent, but because you have understood that not all understanding needs to come from outside. Some things just need to be clear to you. Life begins to present more subtle situations. Less chaos, more silent choices. Less direct confrontation, more internal decisions. It is as if the external scenario were waiting for you to position yourself first. And that requires responsibility. At this point, many people get confused. They think they are stagnant because there are no big events. But in fact, it is the opposite. When the noise decreases, it is a sign that the internal structure already supports more refined movements. Life no longer needs to shout. You begin to realize that some opportunities arise in a discreet way. They do not come as explosions, but as simple possibilities, coherent and aligned with who you have become. They do not demand extreme sacrifices or internal ruptures. They flow. This phase requires attention, not to protect yourself from the world, but so as not to betray yourself. You learn that saying no now is just as important as saying yes. You learn that moving forward at the wrong time can be as harmful as stepping back out of fear. Life observes how you take care of your own energy, how you deal with limits, and how you choose your commitments. There is no haste. There is precision. And this precision is built with everything you have lived up to now. The ascension that is beginning to take shape now does not look like what many imagine. It is not a sudden leap, nor an immediate external change. It is a natural consequence of the internal alignment that has been built over time. You do not rise because you want to. You rise because you are ready. At this stage, life responds differently. Excessive effort loses space. The need for control decreases. You begin to trust more in your own criteria and less in external validation. This does not eliminate challenges, but it completely changes the way you go through them. You realize that you no longer react as before. Situations that once would cause anxiety are now evaluated calmly. People who once would disorganize your emotions are now seen with healthy distance. This does not mean coldness. It means stability. Ascension here is internal before it is external. It appears in the way you choose, in what you accept, and in what you refuse. It appears in the clarity with which you recognize when something no longer makes sense. It appears in the calm of not needing to chase everything. Over time, this begins to reflect externally. More aligned relationships arise. More coherent opportunities appear. Paths that once seemed confusing become organized. Not because everything has become easy, but because you have stopped sabotaging yourself. Life begins to collaborate when it realizes that you are no longer in conflict with yourself. When you stop insisting on what does not fit and begin to respect your own signals, the flow changes. Less resistance, more response. This phase also requires humility. To ascend is not to feel above others. It is to feel more responsible for yourself. It is to know that what you have built can be maintained if you continue acting with coherence. There is no room for carelessness, but there is also no paranoia. You understand that you do not need to announce changes. They are naturally noticed. The tone of your voice changes. The way you occupy spaces changes. Decisions become simpler because they are more aligned. Ascension is not the end of the road. It is a new level of responsibility. But now you no longer walk just trying to survive. You walk with direction, and that changes everything. There comes a moment when you realize that the dynamic has changed. It is not something announced or dramatic. It is subtle. Life begins to respond differently because you have stopped moving from lack, fear, or the constant attempt to fix everything. Before, it seemed that every step required double effort. Now there is less resistance. This does not mean that challenges have disappeared. It means that you have stopped facing them in a disorganized way. You began to choose better where you invest energy. You stop trying to save situations that do not sustain themselves. And this completely changes the flow. Life responds better when it realizes that you are no longer at war with yourself. When you stop insisting on what does not fit, situations reorganize more naturally. Some doors open without struggle, others close without pain. This is a clear sign of internal maturity. The responsibility of sustaining what has been built. Ascending is not reaching an endpoint. It is entering a phase where responsibility increases. Not in the sense of weight, but of care. Everything you have built internally now needs to be sustained with coherent choices. You have already noticed that you can no longer pretend. You can no longer deceive yourself easily. Misaligned decisions generate quick discomfort. Environments that do not match you drain energy almost immediately. This is a sign that consciousness is more active. This phase asks for honesty with yourself. Not perfection, but integrity. You do not need to get it right all the time, but you do need to recognize when something is not working and adjust without drama. Ignoring signs now costs more than before. Responsibility also appears in the way you deal with time. You do not need to rush to prove anything, but you also cannot get too comfortable with what has already been achieved internally. Growth requires maintenance. Clarity requires practice. You learn that saying no continues to be an essential tool. Not to close yourself off, but to preserve what has been built. Not every opportunity is progress. Not every proposal is alignment. Discerning this is part of the maturity you have developed. Sustaining this phase also means accepting that not everyone will accompany your change. Some people remained connected to old versions of you. Others will feel uncomfortable with your new boundaries. This is part of it. It is not rejection. It is consequence. You do not need to convince anyone of your growth. It manifests in the way you live, choose, and position yourself. The stability you have built speaks for itself. Getting this far does not mean that everything is resolved, nor that the path ahead will be simple. It means something more important. You are no longer lost inside your own process. What once seemed like confusion now begins to gain clearer contours. You understand better why certain things needed to collapse, why some people moved away, and why insisting would have cost even more. This phase is not about immediate external achievements, but about internal stability. It is about no longer needing to explain yourself all the time, not needing to prove your worth, and not needing to run after what does not correspond. You have learned, often through pain, that peace is not the absence of challenges, but the ability to go through them without abandoning yourself along the way. What has changed in you may not be easily perceived by those who look from the outside, but it is deeply felt by you. Your reactions are different. Your choices are more conscious. Your boundaries are clearer. This has not made you distant. It has made you more whole. You no longer adapt to just any environment, do not accept just any narrative, and do not cling to expectations that do not make sense. Everything you have lived up to here has built this foundation. Nothing was random. Each phase demanded something specific from you. Resilience, patience, discernment, detachment, maturity. And even when it seemed excessive, you got through it. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary so that you could sustain the next level without breaking. Now life begins to respond in another way. Not because you have become invincible, but because you have stopped fighting against yourself. When there is internal alignment, the external begins to reorganize. Opportunities become more coherent. Conflicts decrease. Decisions gain more clarity. And even when something does not work out, you no longer interpret it as absolute failure, but as a root adjustment. This is a silent turning point. There are no announcements, there is no applause. There is awareness, there is direction. There is the feeling that, for the first time in a long time, you are walking without violating yourself in order to move forward. This is not stagnation. It is steadiness. The most important thing now is to continue respecting this process, not going backward out of fear, nor accelerating out of anxiety. Sustaining what has been built requires constancy, not haste. You do not need to return to old versions of yourself to feel safe. Safety now comes from within. If this message made sense to you, leave in the comments. Which part of your process do you feel you are living now? Sharing your experience can help other people who are going through similar phases and still cannot name what they feel. Your experience may be exactly what someone needs to read today.